Hi everyone, I'm Susan Mulvihill. I'm out in the vegetable garden today because it's time for an update. Here we are going into September. How is that even possible? I swear this has been the fastest vegetable growing season I've ever experienced. But there's a lot to show you and there's many things that have changed, so let's get started. For those of you who are new to my videos, welcome. I am a garden writer who lives in Spokane, Washington, and we are in USDA Hardiness Zone 5B. That means we have short growing seasons and we do have some challenges. My husband and I live on 5 acres, and as you will see, we are very big into vegetable gardening and especially into raised beds. We think those are great. Just like with previous vegetable garden tours, I'm starting out with our hoop house, which is where my husband Bill is growing hot peppers and sweet peppers. We just started doing a big harvest of them because we are making salsa, and he is also chopping them up and freezing them for use later. They're doing great. Here is the bed where we're growing 2 kinds of summer squash. The 3 plants in the foreground are Clarimore, which is a bush type of zucchini that has light colored fruits, and they're absolutely delicious. I actually took quite a large load of them to the food bank yesterday because I just couldn't keep up with them. Now let me show you what's on the back side. You'll notice there is a wire grid, and that's where I have a vining zucchini called Trombetta di Albenga. It is a trombone zucchini that tastes like artichoke hearts. It is absolutely fabulous and we love it. We've been getting quite a lot of fruits off of them in the last 3 weeks. In these next 2 beds, I've planted seeds for cover crops, and specifically buckwheat. Cover crops are a way to enrich the soil because they produce a lot of biomass that you chop down and work into the soil. And so it's a very good way to help the soil after it has been helping vegetables produce all season long. Unfortunately, the quail decided this was for them, and so you can see there's not many seedlings left. There are just lots of little munch marks. Even though I put out some toy snakes to try to keep them away. So I think what I'm going to have to do on these beds is reseed them, which is frustrating, and cover them with either bird netting or floating row cover just until the plants are a little taller. What's under this layer of floating row cover? Well, a few weeks ago I planted the seeds for Swiss chard and beets because I know there's plenty of time in the season to get a crop off of each of them. The reason this cover is over them is because it's keeping away the adult leaf miner fly, which lays eggs on the leaves of beet family crops, so beets, Swiss chard, and spinach, and they can ruin the leaves in nothing flat. So this works beautifully as a barrier to keep them away from the plants. In the last bed of this row, I'm growing 4 rows of carrots and a row of rutabagas. I've been harvesting the carrots for cooking, but I'm also going to leave a lot in the ground so that they can get frosted. You might think that's a bad thing, but actually frosts make the roots even sweeter, which is awesome. Here's the row of rutabagas, and they are doing amazingly well. As I've mentioned in previous videos, I've never grown rutabagas before, and I'm very excited to try them. I've heard the roots have a mustardy flavor, and I think they would be great in soups and stews, so I'm excited to try that. But one lesson I've learned this year, for next year, is that when you're growing a cabbage family crop, make sure you cover it with floating row cover, because some of the leaves have gotten cabbage worms on them, and those are the larvae of the cabbage butterfly. Now, I wasn't planning on eating the leaves anyway, but even so, that stresses the plant, and so next year I'll make sure to cover them with floating row cover. Here's a close-up of the root. Is that crazy or what? Now, one thing I've heard is that if you leave them in the ground and let them get frosted, just like the carrots, it will get sweeter. So that's my goal, is to let them get frosted and then I'll harvest them. Now I'm in the second row, and this is one of our tomato beds. Now, if you saw my video about August garden tasks, you know I talked about pruning tomato plants. This time of year, we are all anxious to have red tomatoes rather than green tomatoes, especially with the season ending. And so what I did a couple of weeks ago is I trimmed off a bunch of extra growth so that the plants would focus their energy on ripening the existing tomatoes. Well, it's time for me to do this again. I'm going to cut back anything that doesn't have a decent sized tomato growing on it, and that will stress the plant and help ripen the tomatoes. So make sure you do that too if you don't have many ripe tomatoes yet. You'll recall these next 4 beds used to have corn growing in them. Well, we had a fabulous harvest of sweetness bicolor. It was amazing, and we are really pleased with it. So once the harvest was over, I cut the stalks down and I planted more cover crops in these beds. Now the first 2 beds you see there have floating row cover over them, again to keep the quail away from the plants, but I also wanted to show you a method we're using to keep the quail away from those tender little seedlings in the other 2 beds. I'd like you to meet Wile E. Coyote. This is actually a coyote decoy, and this really works well to keep birds away from a planting. The important thing to remember is that you want to move them around so they're not always in the same place, because birds and other animals will get habituated to them. We also put some rather noisy pinwheels in the garden, so when the wind blows, that makes a bit of a rattling sound, which is another good way to scare off the birds. Now don't get me wrong, I love birds, but sometimes you got to keep them away from your crops. Right behind Wiley is my celery crop. This is tango celery. You can see it's growing beautifully. I'm going to harvest a bunch of stalks and chop them up to freeze, and then that way I have them on hand for soups and stews during the fall and winter months. So this is doing great. Behind it is my bean arbor, and this is always the highlight of the garden, but you'll notice there's a lot of yellow leaves and it's just looking a little peaked. And that's normal for this time of year. You'll notice there are some big old pods up here, and those are there because I'm saving seeds for next year. This is Musica, and this pole bean is not a hybrid, so I can save the seeds, and what I plant next year will be the exact same type of plant, not like with a hybrid. And so I'm leaving these pods on the vines until they get papery dry. You can see this one here is kind of golden. And when you can hear the seeds rattling around inside the pods, that means it's okay to pick them. You take them indoors for 2 weeks in a nice warm sunny spot. Just leave them in the pods and then open one, see if the seeds are really, really hard. And if they are, you can take all of them out of their pods, put them in a cool, dark area like a basement in my case, inside something like a plastic bag or a jar. Now before I move to another area of the garden, I have to give a shout out to these marigolds. These are absolutely amazing. The variety is Big Duck Yellow. It's an All-America Selections winner for this year, and so I've been trialing them in my garden. I definitely give them 2 thumbs up. Next year the seeds will be widely available, and I would recommend picking them up and putting them in your garden. I love to have color in the vegetable garden, and I know that marigolds are very pungent, and so sometimes they can have pest repelling qualities. Now that I'm in the 3rd row of beds, I wanted to point something out to you. You'll recall that we started out in the hoop house. Well, it is going to be moved this fall once the tomatoes are finished growing, and it will cover 2 beds in this 3rd row. And you'll notice that the farthest bed there is empty. That's where I'm going to be growing some of my winter garden. A few weeks ago I added chicken manure to it just to increase some of the nitrogen in the soil, but it is ready to be planted with some spinach and lettuce. This is the melon bed, and the cantaloupes are doing great. I've got 9 in here, and I notice that they're starting to turn color a little bit, which is a very good sign. You know, knowing when to harvest melons can be a real trick, but there are 3 things you can look for. The skin will become sort of a peachy color. That's a very good sign. Also, where the melon is attached to the vine, it will start to separate. And the last thing, which is not necessarily a happy thing, But if you see yellow jackets and wasps buzzing around it, they can smell that sweetness of the flesh inside. And so that is definitely a good sign that your cantaloupe is ripe. This is the broccoli bed, and I have it covered with Tulle, Tulle, which is bridal veil netting, and that is to keep the cabbage butterflies from getting to the leaves of the broccoli. That has worked just fine. And I'm also experimenting with a way of harvesting the heads of broccoli. If you saw one of my previous videos, you know that what I'm doing with half of the bed is once I harvested that large main head, I cut the plants way back toward the ground, just above the bottom set of leaves. And a friend of mine had told me that if you do that, you will get another large main head and possibly a third if you again cut the plant down. So I haven't seen any main heads yet, so I don't know if this is going to work, but I do have a lot of secondary heads of broccoli that are close to being ready to be picked. And I have an awesome broccoli pasta recipe to try. So that's where they're headed. This is a Cushaw winter squash, and I've got 7 of them growing in this bed. These are wonderful squash, and they make amazing pies. How do you know when a winter squash is ripe? You do the thumbnail test. All you do is you push your thumbnail into the skin, and if it cuts easily into it, that means that it is not ripe. You just leave it alone and let it keep growing and maturing. But if it is hard as can be and you can't cut your fingernail through it, that means that it is ripe. And when you harvest it, be sure to leave as much stem as possible, because if you knock the stem off, that's one area where mold can develop, and you don't want that. So when we get to that point, I'll remind you about curing the squash in a warm area for 2 weeks before you put them into storage, and that way they'll last even longer. There are 2 different crops growing in this next bed. On the right is tomatillos, and we recently harvested a whole bunch of those and made a lot of salsa verde or green sauce with them, and it is wonderful. On the left is spaghetti squash, so let me show you how they're doing. Here's a couple of the spaghetti squash. They're growing really well, and the rind is actually quite hard already, but I'm really in no hurry to harvest them. The next 2 beds have tomatoes growing in them. The first bed has a couple of plants that are Chef's Choice Orange, which is hands down my favorite slicing tomato. The rest of the tomatoes are Gilberti paste tomatoes. We have already harvested them to make salsa. They are fabulous, and the tomatoes are quite large. Here's another look at some of the Gilberti paste tomatoes. Pretty soon we'll be doing the second harvest of them. And I'm doing the same thing with all of these tomato plants as I mentioned with the first bed. I'm going to prune them back again, and if that doesn't do the trick, then about a week or 2 before frost, I'm going to cut off the water and really severely prune them to get those last tomatoes to ripen. Now I'm in what I like to call the south annex of our vegetable garden. We've got 3 beds that are 4 feet wide by 16 feet long. And in this first bed, there's still potatoes growing in there, and I'll harvest them after they get frosted. And then we used to have our peas growing on the supports behind them, and nothing is happening back there. I really need to plant something. I've got a livestock panel arch that's going from the second bed to the third. And even though I had envisioned all of this lush growth, pumpkins and other winter squash hanging down from it, that didn't happen this year because we had a watering problem out here, and so the plants really struggled. Next year that won't happen. But let me show you what's growing in here. In the back of this bed, I've got Swiss chard and beets growing under floating row cover, and then I've got about half a dozen butternut squash. They're not enormous, but still an acceptable size, and so I'm just going to let them grow until they have matured. On the inside of that side of the arbor, I've got sugar pumpkins growing. There are 5 of them, and I'm amazed at how quickly they turned orange. There are also mini pumpkins growing farther back on the trellis. On this side of the trellis, I have cucumbers growing, some different types of small winter squash, and I also have cucamelons. That's what's on these dainty little vines here. And cucamelons are fabulous. You know, not a lot of people have heard of them, but they look like a tiny little watermelon, and they have a citrusy taste with a pleasant crunch. I have yet to get one of these out of the garden because I always have to pop them in my mouth when I see them. But these guys are all doing amazingly well. In the outside of the trellis, I have some more winter squash growing, and then I also am growing some watermelons. I want you to admire this massive watermelon. This is Golden Gold. It's an All-America Selections winner. I think it would be a lot larger if we hadn't had that watering problem. So again, that will not happen next year. But I've got 3 of them growing that I can see, and I'm just kind of waiting to see when I should pick them. I've been looking to see if they're detaching from the stem. Not quite yet, but I'm hoping they're heavenly and worth that growing space. Okay, that's the September vegetable garden tour. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see what happens weather-wise in the next few weeks. Happy gardening!